Hey everyone, so today we're going to dive into a pretty fascinating blueprint for our inner world. It's called the architecture of emotion, and we're going to zero in on one particular model within it, the emotional maturity index, to really get a handle on the design of how we feel and, more importantly, how we react.
You know that feeling, right? We've all been there. That split second where an impulse just takes over and you say or do something and immediately wish you could just hit rewind. That little voice in your head going, ugh, why did I do that? It's a totally universal experience.
But what if I told you this isn't some kind of personal failing or a lack of willpower? What if it's actually about the design, the internal architecture of our emotional systems? The huge gap between a knee-jerk defensive reaction and a more flexible, thought-out response, well, it all comes down to our internal wiring. And that is exactly where the emotional maturity index comes into play. Think of it as a blueprint that helps us understand the very structure of our emotional world and why we do what we do when the pressure is on.
So who came up with this? It was developed by Professor RJ Starr. And this isn't just some standalone idea he had. It's actually a foundational piece of a much, much bigger system he calls the psychological architecture framework, which is all about how our internal systems, our thoughts, feelings, identity, all work together.
Now, what's really powerful here is Starr's own description. He talks about two core patterns, reactive stabilization and differentiated regulation. Okay, what does that mean in plain English? It basically maps out whether our emotional system gets stuck and hardens around these old defensive habits, or if it's able to expand and become more flexible and adaptive.
So when this model talks about emotional maturity, what does it actually mean? Well, it's not about being some Zen master who's calm all the time. Not at all. It's defined as the capacity of your system to handle really intense feelings without totally short-circuiting, without collapsing into those impulsive reactions or just avoiding the feeling altogether. And this is the most crucial part. It's a structural capacity, not a moral report card. It's not about being good or bad.
Okay, so how does this actually work under the hood? Well, whenever we're feeling stressed or under pressure, our emotional system is desperately trying to find some kind of stability. And according to this model, it goes down one of two very, very different paths to get there.
And this table just lays out those two paths perfectly. Okay, so on the left, you've got reactive stabilization. What's its goal? Just short-term relief. Anything to make the bad feeling stop right now. And it gets reinforced because, hey, it works. It rapidly reduces that feeling of strain. But the long-term cost, the system gets more and more rigid, more narrow. Now look at the right side, differentiated regulation. Its goal's way bigger, keeping your whole internal world in sync, systemic coherence. It's reinforced by preserving connection and integrity, which feels way better in the long run. And the outcome? Flexibility and real growth. So you see, both are looking for stability, but their methods and where they end up are total opposites.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. These patterns, they don't just exist in a vacuum. They create this massive ripple effect that ends up shaping our entire psychological landscape.
It all starts right here with a single emotion. Something happens, a feeling gets triggered, and our system has to respond. This is ground zero.
And then, over time, our go-to emotional responses start to literally build our sense of identity. So if we're constantly reacting defensively, we might start to see ourselves as fragile, or maybe as someone who's always under attack. But if we can regulate, we start to build an identity of being resilient.
And that identity, in turn, completely shapes how we find meaning in the world. A reactive style, it tends to create a world full of threats and people to blame. But a regulated style, well, it allows us to find meaning and even opportunity, even when things are tough. It's wild, right? Our smallest emotional habits literally architect our entire reality.
So, if we find ourselves kind of hardwired for reactivity, does that mean we're just stuck? Absolutely not. The model also shows us how we can renovate the system. But, and this is a big but, it also warns us about some common pitfalls where what looks like growth really isn't.
The renovation process really boils down to three key steps. First, you've got to interrupt that reactive loop. You have to recognize that the quick fix of blowing up actually makes your system weaker over time. Second, you have to build your tolerance for discomfort, learning to just sit with the feeling for a minute without having to immediately fix it. And finally, you find a new, way better reward, the deep sense of stability that comes from real coherence and connection.
But this whole process isn't always a straight line. The model points out these things it calls failure modes. And these are so important to understand, because they're these sneaky little ways our old reactive habits can put on a costume and pretend to be genuine growth.
Here are 4 of the most common ones.
First, you've got performative regulation. That's when you look all cool and calm on the outside, but inside you are absolutely boiling with rage. Then there's hyper-reflective rumination, which is getting stuck just analyzing and reanalyzing your feelings instead of actually processing them. Third is moralization, which is basically beating yourself up for having a reaction in the first place, which, surprise, only adds more stress. And finally, rigid boundary absolutism. This is using detachment to just avoid feeling anything at all. All of these might look like progress from the outside, but they're just reactivity in disguise.
Okay, so let's zoom out and land the plane here. What's the big picture takeaway from looking at our emotions through this architectural lens?
And here it is. This is probably the most important insight in the entire model. Real emotional maturity is not about feeling less. It's not about becoming numb or detached. It is about building a stronger, more flexible internal architecture, one that has the capacity to hold and integrate more of life's intensity without breaking.
And remember, this whole thing, this emotional maturity index, is just one part of RJ Starr's larger psychological architecture framework. It's designed to show us how our emotional system is deeply woven into our identity, our thoughts, and the very way we make sense of our lives. It all fits together.
So, I'm going to leave you with a question to mull over. When you're under pressure, when things get really intense, what is your emotional architecture building? Is it building walls of rigidity and defense? Or is it building bridges of flexibility and connection?